Peter Westmacott is a former British ambassador to the U.S., France, and Turkey. He's the author of They Call It Diplomacy. He joins us now tonight from Layinkavak in Turkey. Now, I've got to go back and really make a fine point of this. The restoration of ties and specifically trust, as the president was talking about, seems to be the priority here. And yet you get the sense that Biden needs to turn the clock back, not just those years that Trump was in office, but decades, to a time when Russia, the Soviet Union, shall we say, and communist Russia posed more of a threat. He really wants to try and pose this united threat. Can he be successful at that, especially when you're looking at even these European allies, and they're quite leery?
Well, I think he's trying to do a number of different things. It's not for me to quite predict how the president's going to handle this visit, but from all the signs that we've seen, it looks to me as though, yes, he wants to reset America's relationship with its close allies and like-minded and the countries that share the same values. I'm not sure that he's looking to go back to the days of the Cold War. Russia, clearly he wishes to treat in a different way to the way President Trump did, which was essentially to give President Putin a pass and really to avoid any criticism, or most criticism, of Russian bad behavior, with some exceptions, because he did expel a large number of Russian spies, I recall. I think it's more about America resuming its natural place, as he would see it, as the, if you like, moral leader of the Western world, not in order just to gang up entirely on Russia. Russia is an irritant, can do a lot of mischief, messes about with cyber warfare, interferes with democracy, has a nasty habit of murdering dissidents and opponents, and so on, and even supporting state-sponsored hijacking of civilian aircraft. But there's also the question of what about the very significant strategic challenge posed by China? Very different sort of exercise, different sort of relationship. And I think there too, the president is going to be looking for ways of finding a new consensus with allies, as well as addressing some of the really global issues like vaccine diplomacy and how to deal with coronavirus, and what about climate change, and how do we restore a proper global trading system where it isn't just a war by tariffs and sanctions and other measures which discriminate against countries and have a nasty habit of making everybody worse off. So I think it's taking account of the new realities that we've got in front of us, not just resetting the clock back to the days of the Cold War.
What you're getting at, though, I mean, it's just exhausting to listen to the laundry list. And this alliance, let's face it, has been damaged, because even before, some people were skeptical as to whether or not any of these alliances would amount to anything, even the G7 seen with some kind of impotence, really. But so list the priorities. You talked about them: the security cooperation, the tax harmonization, climate, even vaccines now. How can President Biden make those alliances effective again, especially when you outlined so clearly there the complexities of the China and Russia relationships?
I think when you are bringing together the heads of state and government of the G7, you are looking at establishing personal relationships with people, some of whom he's met, some of whom he'll be meeting for the first time. Now, hard-bitten cynics can say, well, it's all pointless, it's all just a charade, all the work's done before drafting the communiques, and what's the point, so to speak? But I'm not one of those. Yes, there will be lots of hard work, and yes, there's been a tremendous amount of work on the bilateral relationship between Britain and America, as well as the United States and Europe. That's been going on behind the scenes. But this is also about establishing personal relationships of trust and of understanding where each side's coming from and what can be done and what are the real bottom lines. And it may sound not very important to some people, but I suspect that one of the issues on President Biden's agenda, not only for Boris Johnson, but also for the European Union, is what about Ireland, and what about Northern Ireland, and what about the way in which the United Kingdom leaving the European Union with its Brexit potentially is damaging to the stability of Ireland, which has been created by the Good Friday Agreement back in 1998. President Biden is a strong Irish-American Catholic. He's also got British roots, but he's cared for a very long time about what happens in Ireland. So I think that's an issue where he'll be wanting to talk to the British Prime Minister as well as his European colleagues, if you like, at the micro level. But there's also those very big issues that I was talking about. But they come back to establishing relationships of trust and respect and thoroughness. And President Biden is somebody who's well known for doing his homework, reading the briefs, going through the folders, informing himself about the detail. And I like to think that there will be real progress on a number of these very complex issues when these great leaders sit down together in the very informal and hopefully beautiful surroundings of Cornwall.
Yeah, we're not sure if the weather will cooperate, but they are stunning surroundings, even in the rain. As you're speaking, we are looking, of course, at a live picture. We see President Biden will be speaking shortly there from RAF Milden Hall there in England. Yeah. We see U.S. troops awaiting his arrival. I'm glad that you went into that very, crucial relationship, really, between Britain and the United States at such a pivotal time when Europe and Britain are still at odds over Brexit. I don't have to remind anyone here that the Obama administration was very vocal years ago, that it was against Brexit, and President Obama himself very vocal. I was shocked to learn that Boris Johnson and President Biden have actually not met. How do you think that relationship right now, and you were, obviously right on the money in pointing out how crucial that relationship in Northern Ireland is to the entire negotiations going forward. How do you think that personal relationship now, what happens in the coming days, will pivot to really, it's in everyone's interest that Europe and Britain, and they continue to have what is a productive, especially commercially, a productive relationship?
Well, I think let's see where the personal chemistry goes. I think there are certain similarities of the personalities. I personally feel that both Boris Johnson and Joe Biden have a certain sort of extrovert, backslapping, tactile approach to people who they get on with. Both are interested in other human beings. And so I would rather hope that a good personal relationship can be struck up. It is rather extraordinary that they haven't met before. But you're quite right. There is a bit of history here. And not only President Obama, but his then Vice President, Joe Biden, were pretty clear that they thought Brexit was a bad idea. And I think they probably thought that a good part of the campaign that was led in part by Boris Johnson, but also by others, was, shall we say, less than straightforward, less than honest in terms of the commitments that it made about how everything would be wonderful afterwards and life would be as easy as pie in terms of Britain's commercial and economic and other relationships with the rest of the European Union. What we're seeing now, especially in the context of Northern Ireland, and not only in that context, is that it is a lot more complicated than that. And of course, President Biden will be aware that there was a certain affinity between Boris Johnson and Donald Trump. And now, of course, all prime ministers and presidents have to have a good working relationship. But, some of that won't be lost, shall we say. But they will be moving on from that. And I've never had the impression that President Biden was somebody who bears grudges. So he will want to make a fresh start. And he will be glad, I think, to breathe new life and substance into the bilateral relationship with the United Kingdom, even though the UK is now outside the EU. And I think we're going to hear a lot more about that in the next few days, about what's going to happen between the two countries, building on the very strong commercial and investment and if you like, soft power relationship, as well as the military and the intelligence and the cybersecurity and the counterterrorism work that we do together, and the way in which British and American soldiers and diplomats have worked so hard together in difficult theaters like Afghanistan and Iraq and Libya and other places. So I think there's bags of substance there. I think there's a new relationship to be formed with a new prime minister, but I have plenty of confidence that they can be made to work.
And so it begins, really, in the coming hours. Peter Westmacott, I appreciate you standing by for us. We will come to you later in the hour as we await the words from the president there on the ground now, about to start his first foreign trip. Appreciate it, and we'll speak to you in just a few minutes.